Welcome to Hard Knock Life. I am Keith Chow.
I'm Dominic Ma.
Dominic, it's me and you again.
Hi.
You know, I guess everyone else decided since it's Asian American Heritage Month, like we'll just let the Asian guys run with it.
Wow. Conspiratorial. Shade.
Yeah, you're right. Well, since we're rolling solo this week, I decided to bring in a co-host, as it were. He's an amazing writer. You may have heard of a book called Infidel that he did. He's also a former editor at Vertigo. He's written on several TV shows, some we can't talk about. But he's got an amazing book coming out by Image Comics this week on New Comic Book Wednesday. It's called The Good Asian. Please welcome, for our very special Asian American Heritage Month episode, the writer of The Good Asian, Pornsak Pichetshote.
Hey guys, I've never actually had a proper intro before. That was really cool.
Yeah, well, I do my best.
I half expected like lasers and me to like run in and like do lo-fi.
Air horns.
Yeah, exactly.
Welcome to the podcast. I think you've been on before.
Have
like
I?
a long time ago. I feel like you and I talked about Infidel.
I mean, maybe you're right. The thing is, I'm so used to talking to you.
Yeah.
I can't remember like when it's like
when
recorded.
it was recorded.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, I record every phone call we've ever done.
Right,
I have
right.
an entire.
It's all logs. Yeah.
You just said a lot about the times we're living in.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, whenever you talk to him, it has been recorded by someone.
True.
I'm sure.
These
I'm
days,
very sure.
Whether it's Tim
Google
Cook
or Facebook or
Yeah.
somebody has it. But
Well, no, it's amazing to have you, especially so timely. It's Asian American Heritage Month. You have a brand new book, I think, timed specifically to come out the week of Asian American Heritage Month. I wanted to ask you, you and I have talked about this book for some time now, and I'm excited that it's finally coming out. What do you want the world to take away from The Good Asian? And before you even get to that, for those of us who may not be familiar with the book, what is The Good Asian?
So The Good Asian is a genre that we've made up that we're calling Chinatown Noir. And it's a 1936 detective mystery featuring the first generation of Americans who grew up beneath an immigration ban, the Chinese. So it's very much about a generation of Americans, Chinese Americans living in San Francisco Chinatown under the shadow, or I should say, where the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed in 1882 was the only thing they knew their entire lives. So they're coming of age with that being all that they knew. And it's about Edison Hark, who is a Chinese American detective inspired by Asian crime solvers like Charlie Chan and Mr. Moto, but kind of acknowledging the Asian American history of the fact that one about the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Immigration Act of 1924 that didn't allow Asian and Arabs into the country, and the fact that, mainland America didn't have a Chinese American cop until 1957. So it takes all that. But at the heart of it, it is sort of a gumshoe noir detective story about a guy looking for a missing girl that stumbles on a murder, that stumbles on a conspiracy, and hopefully acknowledges all these parts of Chinese American, but really Asian American history that we kind of let ourselves forget. And that's sort of the book.
That's the book. I mean, that's a hell of a pitch. I mean, anyone who's heard that should be going to your comic shops and getting it on your pull list right away. I love that you mentioned that, it is kind of very much in the tradition, let's say, of Charlie Chan, right? But actually created by Asian Americans this time. Because, I mean, the dirty secret, it's not even a secret, right? The Charlie Chan books were never for Asian Americans. Were never by Asian Americans. Like, what inspired you to, like, go into that, detective noir, knowing that the Charlie Chan of it all was going to be a shadow over it? Was that intentional, or did you want to reclaim that?
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of reclaiming. There's definitely a lot of reclaiming it. It was just, to me, however it is my, pop culture sort of obsessed brain works, is that like when I heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Immigration Act and really like educated myself on what it is, one, I was just like, I can't believe as an Asian American, I didn't know about this. And then two, it was just like, and I used to like watch a lot of those movies when I was a kid. And I don't even know like to what degree I watched them. I think they were on, I was just sort of like mesmerized or intrigued by them, but I saw a lot of them. And so it was this idea that like, wow, that character, because Charlie Chan was enormously popular for like decades, with like, it was like a global franchise or all these movies. And the fact that it hit the height of its popularity during a time where Asian immigrants couldn't even come into the country was fascinating to me. And there was so much there. So that's where it sort of started, that the idea of it. And then, when I looked more into sort of Charlie Chan, I looked into sort of the real life inspiration for him, Changapurna, who was a detective in Hawaii, and the fact that, first of all, Changapurna's life, like, his life is too comic booky for like a comic book. Like, the man like wielded a bullwhip because he used to be a cowboy. He had a scar in his eye that he got into a fight with someone who had a sickle. Like, just the fact that you got into a fight with someone who has a sickle in anywhere but a comic book is like crazy,
Sickle versus bullwhip.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's
wild.
that's like Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of shit. But sorry, I distracted because I didn't realize, I couldn't remember if you guys can curse on this.
Oh yeah, but curse all you want.
Okay, good. But
because it's Asian Month.
That's right.
We get to curse more
specifically for that. But yeah, but the really interesting thing about Changapurna is that the reason why they needed, or the use that they found for a Chinese American detective, was they used to send him into Chinese gambling and opium dens and kind of be a spy and sort of be like, all right, these are the people you need, and then he would come out and tell the cops who are raiding, like, who to catch and who to look out for. And he was used to round up Chinese lepers and send them over to Molokai. And so the idea that, certainly by today's standards, like, he's kind of a race traitor, and that to me was such an interesting dynamic, to take all that stuff and apply the racial lens of today and sort of look at all that. And also because in that, and I think it's one of the things you're always looking for in genre, is like, how do you take something that's heightened but actually speaks to something sort of like very universal? There was something to the core, that core of straddling two worlds and like two cultures and trying to figure out what your place in it, which I feel like, certainly every Asian American, certainly every immigrant American feels, but to heighten it and literalize it into something like that just felt like a wonderful, realm to sort of play in. And after that, the rest of it kind of came as it kind of comes, but that character and that conflict was so interesting to me that's the reason why I wanted to do the book.
That's so interesting because, it struck me that the noir detective genre really could lend itself to, typically Asian American problems in this way. Like, I think it's, again, by the way, this book hasn't come out yet, we haven't read it, but in the press materials, it even describes him as a self-loathing detective. And, sort of one of the classic heroes in the noir genre, in my understanding, they're a guy who is kind of invisible. These are detectives, they're not the out front superheroes. These are guys who are kind of detectives. They're often kind of haunted by some self-destructive thing. And so even just, I don't know how blunt you want to be about the thing of partly hating yourself is sort of baked into these noir detective protagonists.
Yeah, totally. And that's one of the reasons why, a lot of it for me is I kind of find whatever subject matter I'm kind of drawn to, I'm almost drawn to the genre. A lot of times it's like spinning a wheel of fortune of just kind of like, here's what I want to talk to, like, what is the right genre to sort of like talk about this? Because like my brain is just addled with sort of genre sort of stuff. And there were so many like great, the jaded, burnt out detective, the bleak world that doesn't care, the self-loathing, like all that sort of stuff, the femme fatales, and just even like the way, the Chinese in Chinatown were depicted in noir in general. Like, it's such an integral part of noir. Yeah. So like there are all these things that just felt like, oh my God, it's all just sort of waiting to do. It's just, all it needs is someone dumb enough to devote so much energy to the research to try to put it all together. And then and it feels like you could have something potentially really cool.
Thank God that person exists.
Yeah, exactly.
I gather.
I remember it was one of, I had a manager or agent was like, don't talk about the book, like someone might steal it. I'm like, let them steal it. Like if it stops me from having to do years of research, like, good on them.
Totally. I mean, and it's also such an interesting time when you say, like, I don't remember who Mr. Moto is at all, but I mean, I know it, that name is somewhere in my head. Yeah. Like, I know he exists. So some of these, like, old classic, we would say, stereotypical Chinese characters, Shang-Chi's father used to be Fu Manchu, right? Yeah. And we're all comics guys here. I can't remember. Fu Manchu hasn't been Shang-Chi's father for a while, has he?
No, I don't believe so. Because I think Marvel lost the rights to use Fu Manchu, I believe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Oh, okay, but I mean, still, like, even when those characters were being created, still those classic stereotypical characters were like embedded in their conception. So, but just think it's fascinating.
Good Asian, it kind of like fits a pattern that we've been seeing over the last few years when it comes to like Asian Americans finally being able to like, you talked about reclaiming the stereotype, right? Because, the Mr. Moto, the Charlie Chan is clearly like a genre fiction stereotype of Asians. And just in the last few years, I did a post on Twitter a couple weeks ago at this point where, we all have varying opinions on whether or not an Asian American should have been cast as Danny Rand, although those many years ago. But that's pointless now because we have an Asian American Shang-Chi, we have an Asian American Snake Eyes, we have an Asian American Kung Fu show on the CW, right? Like we have Asian Americans reclaiming the martial arts stereotype, right? And then imbuing those characters with humanity. I've talked about several weeks now. I'm so geeked that Tony fucking Leung, the god, is playing the Mandarin, right?
Yeah, that's so cool.
If you told me like 5 years ago the MCU is going to have the actual Mandarin, not the Ben Kingsley version of the man, but an actual Mandarin, I'd have been like, I don't know if I'm excited about that. But it's like you got an Asian American screenwriter, you have an Asian American director, and you have the fucking god Tony Leung playing it. I'm all in. Like I even, I went out. Got a Tony Leung action figure.
Wait,
Keith is showing us the action figure.
For those of you listening.
What's that from?
That's the Shang-Chi. That's the Mandarin.
That's out already?
The Marvel Legend action figure. Yeah, they're all out. They're out in stores, even though the movie doesn't come out for a few more months.
Oh, damn. This is what I get for not leaving my house. I had no idea.
No, but so, like, that...
And the rings are bracelets now.
Yeah, the rings are bracelets. Yeah. No, but I love that, right? I love that we can take what was once considered untouchable, right?
Yeah.
Like, actors always say, like, I don't want to play those roles. But instead of, like, I don't want to play those roles, let's take those roles and actually imbue them with character and humanity. Because that's what's been missing. It's not the role itself. As you said, the film noir detective, like, that in and of itself is an archetype. It's not a stereotype.
Yep.
So why can't an Asian American be part of the archetype and not the stereotype, right?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that that certainly drew me to it, too, was... it was also a classic American hero, but also it was something, and especially with characters like Charlie Chan, Mr. Moto, and all that kind of stuff. They were Asian and American in a way that didn't lean on so many of the tropes of Asians. They weren't martial artists. There wasn't any mysticism. There wasn't any sort of that sort of stuff. It's one of the reasons why, like, one of my favorite Asian characters in comics is Jimmy Woo, and Randall Park is like killing that role.
Right.
But it's also because just like, it's not a legacy character. It's not based on any sort of like orientalized sort of, stereotype. He's just an FBI agent, which is kind of awesome. And you can kind of play with that. And, there's much more room to do things with it.
I was wondering if you could talk about the title a little bit, because I think it's, if I may, a confrontational title.
Yeah. It is.
And I mean, just for like, for recent context, I was just, when there was a lot of coverage about the hate crimes against Asian Americans recently, like on MSNBC, they sort of trotted out their one Chinese American guy who's a regular host on that show, God bless him. But they kept trotting him out to talk about, the model minority myth. And he would talk, he just framed it as, talking about, am I a good Asian or not a lot? Am I that model minority? And it was a little awkward because it was clear, like, he accepted the idea that the model minority was a thing. Like there was
true.
a good... Yeah, like there was a good Asian that you could be. And I get that. And I respect, it's awkward interviewing styles or whatever, but it was also just like, how much have we internalized that idea of the good Asian?
That's a really good question. And I think that it's such sort of a big question of like, and it's something I'm really interested in. It's like, how much have we internalized that? And I feel like, and I guess you guys correct me if you guys feel differently, like it is such a personal sort of question. And it feels like, different people will have sort of different answers to it. Like I know all throughout my life, I've heard jokes amongst other Asians about, and I've made them too, about what's, good Asian, bad Asian. Like, oh, I'm a bad Asian because I did this. I'm a good Asian because I did that. And this whole idea, this yardstick of, the degree of Asianness that you should have, and if you don't, this litmus test, if you're not enough, you're a bad Asian. If you do enough, you're a good Asian. And what does that mean? And all that. So like, in terms of how it relates to the book, like, to me, it's meant to be confrontational. It's definitely meant to, as soon as you hear it, hopefully, as soon as you hear the term "the good Asian," what you're left to think is like, oh, well, what is a bad Asian then? Like, what does that mean? And you're already starting that conversation sort of in your head. But also, sort of in the book itself, it's about, the position which Hark finds himself sort of as a Chinese American detective and one of the only ones. Like, he's asking himself sort of what his relationship is with his community. And he's also finds himself like, I did this because I wanted to help. I became a cop because I wanted to help my community, but the laws of the land don't consider my community to be equals. And so me just being good, like, what does that mean? Does that mean upholding the law of the land, or does that mean being faithful to my people? And beyond just being good, what is the good Asian response to that? So it's meant to sort of conjure up all these sort of and I do think it's part of just being an Asian American, of when you're straddling these two worlds and you're just kind of left. I mean, you even think about like, the East versus the West and how the priorities are so different, right? Like, classically the East is more community based, the West is more individual based. And so as an Asian American, if you're grown up with both of those cultures, like, well, what is the space, what is the overlap that you decide is yours, and to which degree do you want to lean in? And I do wonder if that's one of the reasons why you hear terms like the good Asian, the bad Asian as much as you do, because, so much of the culture of the East and the West seem in contradiction to one another. So you're constantly left with having to negotiate. All right, if I draw my line in the sand here, am I being loyal to one at the expense of the other? And how am I supposed to feel about that? So I think, to me, the good Asian kind of conjures up all that conversation.
Yeah, because I mean, it's along two axes, right? I mean, that's one of the interesting things is like there's a question of being a good Asian. There's the model minority paradigm, which is shitty, which is just like, are you good because you're American enough? You're American enough to be accepted. On our side, there's also the axis of are you like good at being Asian? Like, are you an Asian enough? We have those two things going on all the time. I am not a good Asian at being Asian. I have a dumb baby's grasp of Mandarin and all that stuff. But I'm better at being American. Does that make me good? I don't know.
Right. Well, like, which I talked about last week in my Nerd Poppin, right? Like some of the grief that I read online when Invincible came out, and the character of Mark Grayson was not any ethnicity, which defaults to white in the comics, but in the animated series they purposefully cast Steven Yeun, so now they cast Sandra Oh to play his mom, so now they're Asian American characters in this animated superhero series. And I saw people complaining that they weren't being Asian enough because the mom decided to give him chips and soda instead of like cut up fruit, and didn't take their shoes off in the house. That kind of like we put our labels on ourselves, and if you don't do this enough, you're not you don't drink boba, you're not Asian enough, or whatever the fuck, right? But I did want to circle back to what you had said about how this book is very much a 2021 lens on being Asian in the 1930s. And, the point you made about being a Chinese cop, I think is also relevant and timely in this conversation we're having about model minority, right? Because if you think of like, what does it mean to be a model minority, to be a police officer when you're Asian, right? Because I think about like Peter Liang, I think about Tao Toa in Minneapolis. Like, these are Asian cops killing unarmed black people, right? Like, there's so much of that like model minority myth that goes into like why they're police and why they're, where are they viewed on that spectrum when it comes to like Blue Lives Matter or whatever, you know what I mean? Yeah. And I wonder, how much do you interrogate that with Edison?
I mean, it's definitely sort of the intent. I mean, part of the book, one of the things, it's definitely an intent to sort of interrogate that, but also to sort of take it one step back. Like, to me, so much of the book is about his relationship to whiteness as well as his relationship to the Asian community. So in the book, and I made this choice because it was the only way a Chinese person could have become a cop in Hawaii at the time was through white patronage, and that's how Changaparna became a cop. And so I made a decision in this book so that he was adopted by a sort of a white family, that his mother, who was their maid, died in was murdered while working there, and out of guilt the millionaire father said, like, I'm going to raise you sort of one of my own. And so much of the book is about his relationship between whiteness and about his relationship with Asianness. And I think as an extension of that, it becomes his relationship with his job and it's sort of being a cop. Because I do think part of what we say sort of like about the model minority and sort of being American, it's about our relationship with whiteness and sort of like, and so much of the laws of the land, and that's, definitely is incorporated within period in history in 1936 the book takes place in, Asians' lives didn't count as much as white lives. And so part of, wanting to count as a person, wanting to count as a man meant measuring yourself up to sort of this white yardstick. And so, and I think part of that, the cop aspect, I feel like, is an extension of that for Hark. It's a way to say, I matter just as much as sort of these white people, because I am a person of color. And, it's something that we've seen through people of color all throughout history, that, you have to do twice as much to get, do twice as much to get half. And so for him, twice as much means I'm going to be a cop. I'm going to be a super cop. I'm going to uphold and champion the law of the land. Well, what does that mean, though, when that is weaponized against my community?
I missed it. What city is it set in? Or
it's set in San Francisco. So Hark himself is from Hawaii, and so he travels to his family. His white family now lives in San Francisco, and part of the book will talk about like why he's estranged from his family and all that. But it's his first time being in San Francisco Chinatown.
Really?
How many issues total is it going to be?
It's 9. It's I very much wanted sort of a nice big sort of mystery. And that's the other thing too, that again, every genre has its own sort of tricks and tools that come with it. But there's a lot of stuff I wanted to touch, partly about Chinatown, partly about sort of the working class, sort of in Chinatown at the time, part of like what it felt like or what it feels like to be sort of an Asian with privilege, trying to sort of like relate to that. And so there's a lot of topics I wanted to cover. And fortunately, part of the tropes of noir is a nice twisty turny mystery that kind of gives me the opportunity to go to all these places.
Do you have plans for beyond an issue 9 if ever that were the case?
Yeah,
because the other thing about Charlie Chan is that there are multiple stories, multiple cases.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to do more. I am way too superstitious to commit to more until like sales of the book are in or anything like that. But like if sales of the book come in, and the other thing too is like, when you're doing it serially, you can be like, yeah, we're doing great. And then like 2 months later, like, oh no. So like once all the sales come in and we're like, okay, this is a nice, healthy, sustainable thing, I would absolutely love to do. I already have ideas on what future volumes look like. Unfortunately, they also involve a massive amount of research on my part. So that might be the other thing. Like I'm procrastinating. They're like, well, let's not start just
Let's
yet.
not be too successful just yet.
Yeah. Let's make sure there are people showing up before I dive back into all those history books.
9 is a lucky number, and maybe it'll beget future multiples of 9.
Yeah, hopefully, fingers crossed.
I was wondering if I could ask, because on this show, sometimes I like to harp on, disaggregating the Asian American monolith whole, so people can have clarity on the thing. And I mean, no attack at all by this, but you're Thai, right?
Yes.
We're Thai by extraction, and that. So, can you speak a little bit about going into this Chinese American story?
Yeah, totally. Well, so I am ethnically Chinese on my dad's side. That said, I self-identify as Thai American. And the reason for that is that whenever, when I in high school, I spent high school in Thailand. And whenever my parents used to argue about politics, whenever my dad was losing, he would end the argument with, this is the problem with you Thai people. You just don't understand. And my mom would be like, you asshole, you don't, no, he's like, you asshole, you're Thai. He's like, no, I'm not, I'm Chinese. And she'd be like, you don't speak Chinese, you've never been to China, like, don't give me that Chinese crap, like, you're Thai. And so as a result, I've always sort of self-identified as Thai American, because she would always win the argument. But what happened is later on in my dad's life, he would get like increasingly obsessed with his Chinese roots. And so anytime I went home, he was always watching some documentary about China. He was always talking about Chinese dams. He was like, just like obsessed with it. And then when he passed, like, I think part of processing the loss was wanting to like learn more about my Chinese roots, because he had been so obsessed with them. And it was in that process that I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I always find it fascinating, just like reflecting on myself, that, and I can only assume it's because I have such an interest in Americana, that like normally if you see a story like that, it would be an interest in like Chinese history or Chinese mythology. And for me, it just went to Chinese American history. And so, but that's kind of where that was a sequence of events that kind of got me into that. And so a lot of it is, I don't have the typical experience sort of as an Asian American, because for me, I was born in America. At 12, I moved back to Thailand. I spent high school there and then came back for college. So for me, I don't have the typical experience of an Asian American, much less a Thai American, much less a Chinese American. But I think also, part of what the book about to me is trying to figure out as an Asian American writer, because of my background being what it is, I've always sort of seen like, what is my relationship with other Asian Americans? What are Asian American themes? And it was something that, Keith had said it to me in a bar once when I was having this conversation with him like ages ago that stuck with me ever since, where he made the analogy to like Latinos, and like Latinos come from different cultures and different countries, but at least they share the same language. Asians, we don't even do that. And so as an Asian American writer, I've always been like, all right, so what are Asian American themes? Like, what are we talking about when we say that? And so much of that thinking is kind of what goes into the book as well. It is something that Edison is sort of thinking in every scene he's in. It's like, what's my relationship to other Asian Americans ultimately? And that definitely sort of comes from me. I mean, being self-identifying as Thai American, like there's not a lot of us here. So like, and then when you talk about Thai Americans who spent half of their life in one country and half their life the other. So again, it's just like, to what point do I connect with quote unquote the Asian American experience? Yeah. And as a writer, and I say I want to write about the Asian American experience, like what am I writing about? What does that mean? And so these are all sort of the questions that I have coming into the work, and just as me as a person.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you saying all that, and I'm sorry I didn't mean to come off as the Chinese jerk with that.
No, not at all.
You're not Chinese enough, Pornsak.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's another axis that we could talk about if we're getting deeper into. A lot of Asian Americans have some amount of Chinese in them.
Yeah,
full Chinese, because there's a big Chinese diaspora. It's all over the place, and that's another axis where you're like, am I Chinese enough, or I am Thai enough, or the other part of my heritage enough? Because without getting too deep into it, China is another big sort of oppressive monolith in certain ways in the world. It's a superpower. So that's another dichotomy we're working with all the time.
But I'm really glad you asked it, because I do think it sort of speaks to something that as we're talking about it, like I do wonder if that is one of the things that connects the Asian American experience. This idea, because it's
wrestling against Chinese.
No,
sorry.
This whole like yardstick, because like if you even track this conversation, it started with the yardstick of like what's American enough, what's Asian enough, and then it goes to, well, what's Chinese enough? What, like there's always this sort of, it's an interest, and I think going back to what you just said, like Chinese is such a big diaspora, it incorporates so much. I'm definitely not the only Thai person I know that forgets to account for their Chinese side when they're talking about being Thai. So I do think, I don't know, like I do wonder if it's not a completely separate subject. Like I do wonder if all this is all part of the same conversation at the end of the day.
Sure.
And I think that the idea of like disaggregating that Dominic likes to talk about, it's almost like an anachronism in the book, right? Because even in 1936, the notion of being Asian doesn't exist.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right? There is no Asian. Like you talk about a confrontational title. If you really wanted to be confrontational, you should have named it The Good Oriental or The Good Chinaman, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what we were called. We were Chinaman or we were Oriental. We weren't Asian. Like the notion of like various Asian ethnicities forming a political identity didn't happen until 30 years later.
Yeah.
In real life, at least, right? But that's part of also, like you said, you pitched the book as looking at 1930s through the lens of a 2021 framework, right?
Yeah. No, it is sort of really fascinating in terms of like, just the language sort of at the time. Like you said, like Asian didn't exist. Like the Chinese referred to themselves as Orientals, or like you say, sort of Chinamen. The Asian community didn't refer to white people as white people. They referred to them as Americans. Like that was just sort of the status quo at the time.
Or white devils. That's
white devil. Yeah. The literal Chinese. I mean,
I always thought ghosts or
white ghosts. Yeah, but no, it just like white devils. Is
again,
more,
I'm not my Chinese is terrible, so I don't know.
I think the literal translation is white ghost, but like I just like translating to white devil because it fits more with like Elijah Muhammad, the blue-eyed, his teachings of the blue-eyed devils. Anyway, no, I'm very excited. Full disclosure, I did get to read at least issue number 1 just because we're cool like that. So I'm excited that the world gets to see it on Wednesday, and it's about damn time. I don't know how much you can talk about. Infidel got picked up to be adapted beyond comic books. Do you hope for potential studios to come knocking and creating your own entry into the Charlie Chan, Mr. Moto like film series where you can cast a white dude, to play Edison Hart?
Right.
Like Jim Sturgis needs a job. Maybe he can play Edison Hart.
Yeah. He's got such range. That Jim Sturgis.
That was a deep cut Asian casting complaint joke right there. Well done, Keith.
I would
The
never
gambling movie.
I mean, I could have made the easy joke and said Scarlett Johansson.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, she gets
that's the
enough
easy
shit.
one. That's easy.
Right.
No, but,
yeah.
would you love to see?
I would
good
love
Asian-
to see that. I would love to see good Asian movie, TV show, whatever, animated series, whatever it would be. Like I would yes, I would absolutely love to see that. And and like you sort of said, like it feels like it's time. Like it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like a women of prayer as much as maybe it has in the past. So yeah, I would love to. I would love for that to happen. Absolutely.
Well, we're excited. I don't know how much you can talk about Infidel, but I'm also very excited that that's happening. I know it's so early times for that, but that's such a fascinating book as well.
Thank you.
I'm just happy for your success. Before we wrap, I did want to touch on one other thing. In another life, I mentioned this at the top. You used to be an editor at not just DC Comics, but for an imprint that's near and dear to my heart that no longer exists. You were an editor at Vertigo. And just this week, Netflix dropped a trailer for a series called Sweet Tooth.
Yes.
And the trailer's awesome. It stars Will Forte. It's amazing. But the one thing that kind of like made me a little sad is that in the trailer it says from the DC comic.
Yeah.
Right? And I was like, was it though? Because I remember back in the day there was a hard line between what was DC and what was Vertigo. And Sweet Tooth was very much a Vertigo book. Of course, created by Jeff Lemire. You were an editor at Vertigo when that book came out, right?
Yeah, I actually edited that book for about a year and a half. So
wow.
I love working with Jeff Lemire. First of all, Lemire is a friend. He's awesome, the nicest guy. But that trailer is so good. Like, it's so good. Like, it's like, I think like the whole like Tim Burton like feel of that trailer is just like genius and so utterly perfect. Like, it was one of those things that like I actually feel confident I can divorce myself, that even if I didn't love the book and love Jeff as much as I did, I would still go geek crazy over that trailer. Like, I love, and it looks fantastic. So I'm so psyched. Also, I think too, like, it feels like I can't believe there aren't more like Tim Burton-esque TV shows out there, like, period. Like, talk about something I didn't know I wanted until it was put in front of me. Like that, just like, oh yes, like I so want that.
Or even like, why aren't there more mining of like Vertigo legacy titles, right? I mean, we had Preacher, of course, we had iZombie. I think that's it though, right? In terms of like, I mean, I know people have been trying to adapt like Sandman for years,
well, I mean, but they're like shooting Sandman now, so we'll see how that goes.
Is it fair to say Sandman was the Superman of the Vertigo like wing of the universe?
Kind of, yeah.
Didn't he sort of lead the flock? I haven't read a ton of Vertigo stuff.
But but that's totally true though. Like, Sandman was like the icon. I mean, Lord knows there was a chunk of Vertigo's history where, for all intents and purposes, they were just publishing Sandman in like different forms.
Right.
And then they kind of branched out. But they're shooting the pilot to DMZ, and I'm really psyched.
Oh, that's right.
Sarah Dawson's in that.
Ava DuVernay is attached to that too, right?
Yeah. So there's that. Somewhere out there, they shot a scalped pilot that I haven't seen.
Oh, wow.
And I really wish they would put that up somewhere so people could see.
So, I mean, and maybe you need to recuse yourself from this question, but like, do you wish though that even if they disbanded the actual imprint and they're no longer publishing Vertigo books, don't you think though that the brand Vertigo, like the name Vertigo and the legacy of Vertigo is so, and Dom knows how I feel about like branding.
I have a rant about this, but please go ahead.
Okay, but like, I just feel like, the brand itself of Vertigo has so much meaning. Maybe to old heads like me, millennials and Zoomers probably could give a shit. But like, to folks our age who read comics back in the late 80s, early 90s, the imprint Vertigo, the name, the brand, the logo is so iconic that if to see that on, like, in front of a trailer or in front of like, the way that you see the Marvel logo.
Yeah.
On a big screen or on your computer screen, as it were. Like, I don't know. There's just something about that. Like, I used to geek out, even though iZombie, the show, was nothing like the book. I would geek out by seeing the Vertigo logo on the CW. You know what I mean? So, like, I don't know. How do you feel about it? How do you feel about, like, the erasure of like Vertigo as an entity beyond just like disbanding the imprint.
I mean, it's tough for me, like I was there for 7 years. It's some of the best years of my life. I was sort of working at Vertigo. I loved everything I did there. Like I understand the challenges that DC faced. I mean, part of the problem was, and I'll be honest, I don't understand why, but part of the problem was that when people saw the Vertigo brand, they thought, we can order this later. Like they never managed to like get the urgency, whereas like an Image book would come out. And partly it was because like Image at the time, and they've done such a good job protecting this, but there was a time where if an Image book came out, you didn't know if you get a collection, and so people were like, we got to buy this, because you don't know. And unfortunately, like retailers always started to take for granted the fact, like, because Vertigo was the first place to like really pioneer like the book trade collection, and
right.
like, Sandman was the first book, to like have those out. And unfortunately it turned out into this thing where it backfired against them, where everyone's just like, if the book is good, I'll check it out and trade. And then the numbers would come in low, and that would just, lead to sort of low book sales and all that. And unfortunately, like that education well, I think then partly it was it was reversing that education process, and then partly because the deals at a place like Image got so much stronger, that gave you so much more freedom and all that it became less of a lure to sort of publish your stuff for Vertigo. But I think there's a lot of places out there that are trying to sort of be the next Vertigo. And the one thing I will sort of say too, that the other way I look at it is like, while I hate the fact that Vertigo no longer exists, the fact that the Vertigo no longer exists means there's like 5 or 6 mini Vertigos like in the industry right now. Like everyone who's working at Vertigo is still working, making the same book. Like the book I'm writing is the Vertigo book. Like,
for sure. Like, I mean, like to your point, Image kind of took over that, mature, prestige, weird, right? Like just different from superheroes. Like, I mean, to your point, like retailers who were very much in like a superhero mindset, probably, in the pre-Image, or when Image wasn't what it is now, when Image was just like their own, like Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee superheroes, right? Like, it's funny how Image had kind of morphed into its own version of Vertigo over the a book like Saga would very much been a Vertigo book in the 80s, right?
100%. And like, and that's not even including the fact that like Karen Berger's still doing Berger books through Dark Horse. Right. Mark Doyle is now at IDW, so like there's a lot of, people, and like, Vault has done like a really good job at sort of curating their line to putting out interesting stuff. So there's a lot of people out there doing it. The thing that I miss most about Vertigo that I don't think gets enough attention is the fact that under Karen's sort of guidance, it was such an editor strong imprint that the ethos was really about protecting and bolstering writers and giving them the opportunity to succeed. And that is the aspect of it where, not being at the other companies, I can't sort of say if the other companies are given those kind of resources. Every company I think has like great editors that I can think of off the top of my head. Like, wow, they're doing some sort of great stuff. Not walking in their shoes, I don't know if they have a Karen Berger there to sort of protect them, to sort of say, hey, I'm going to give you and your creators the space to like take chances and really, because you would hear a lot about how so-and-so Vertigo creator would work on a Marvel DC book, and they would just be kind of like, oh, I guess they're just like, they're just not a superhero person because I don't like their superhero work as much. And it was always kind of like, well, maybe, but also they didn't have the editorial staff that really knew how to bring the best out of them.
How to nurture them, right.
Yeah. So that's, when I think about what I miss about Vertigo, that's the thing I miss the most, is that, like, unfortunately, one of the things that sort of seems to, and it's so ironic and such a contradiction that like comics in a weird way are doing better now than they ever have, and yet the resources to make them are stretched thinner than they've ever been.
Right.
So like, like there was a time where DC, had this great editorial staff that was the right sort of proportion to the book that they were editing, and it was like the only place I knew that was the case. But sort of after the recent DC bloodletting, they're all very stretched thin. The irony to that, though, I guess, is that from what I understand, even though they're stretched thin, they're given the freedom now to do like, they're not hamstrung.
Oh,
by
it's like a
continuity
creative
anymore.
Resurrection at DC
Yeah.
over the last several months,
Yeah.
despite the fact that like all of our friends no longer have work.
Yeah.
but
no, exactly.
But it is the cruel irony of that.
Yeah. Like that's what it took to get that kind of freedom.
You know, I always like to harp on the loss of Vertigo whenever I get the chance to talk to you, Pornsak. So that's wanted, especially with the Sweet Tooth trailer coming out this week. It was like,
I feel you, man.
And I also thought it was a missed opportunity. Why is this not on HBO Max? Why is this on Netflix? Come on, Warner. Come on, AT&T. Anyway,
all of that stuff is just sort of fascinating in terms of like the corporate politics of like what goes where.
Exactly.
And
trust me, that we don't have another hour. I could go on and on about.
Because again, Keith is the guy who's still mad that HBO Max is not called Warner Brothers Plus. he has this real bone to pick about the exact branding of the universe. So I just think it's hilarious. Again, you bring up that they would say DC Presents or from the DC comics instead of the Vertigo comics. That's a very nerd distinction to make.
It's a very Keith nerd distinction as well.
It's specifically Keith nerd distinction making. It's a DC comic. People know what DC is.
Sure, I guess.
Vertigo does sound cool. Maybe it's already someone else's production company name.
That's possible too.
It actually is. It actually is.
There you go.
Yeah.
Oh well.
And people don't want to be like here, like from Vertigo. Like they'll just think it's some like weird. Anyway.
Yeah. Well,
wherever that
I don't disagree with you though. Like anytime I sort of see from the DC comic, I'm still like, wait, what DC comic is this? I'm like, that is like my knee jerk. Like, wait, what?
Sure. Fair enough.
Well, with that, we're going to end. Before we do, we always have this recurring segment where we ask everyone what's Nerd Poppin', and Pornsak, that's basically what's the thing in geek world that you're geeking out about. So, as our special guest this week, I'll start with you. What is the thing in the world, in the nerd world specifically, that you're very excited about?
I have to be unoriginal. Like, that Sweet Tooth trailer really is. Like, I'm so psyched about that trailer. It I feel like it blew everything else out in my head because I just love that trailer so much.
Yeah. No, and the other thing that I did think about the trailer itself is that because it says it's from a DC comic and it's got this like cute kid deer thing in it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if people realize like it gets a lot weirder and fucked up. So like, it's because ultimately at the end of the day, it's a Vertigo book. So like, if you're a 5-year-old saying that looks cute, I don't know if you want to watch the entire series. That's all I'm saying.
The other thing I'm actually really curious is like how sort of dark it's going to get. Because it's funny, like when we were making the comic, we didn't think I don't think there was never a conversation like this is Tim Burton-esque, like because it's so comics, like like oh yeah, you have a kid that like half deer and like he's running around an apocalypse, like you don't even blink an eye if you think about that in comics,
right?
But then you see a trailer for it and it's like, oh, it's Tim Burton-esque, like that's genius, that's exactly how you want to communicate it to an audience. And so so I cannot believe how psyched I am for
I mean, and
that.
it just shows like the renaissance we're living in, where like a book like Sweet Tooth can finally get adapted into a live action series. Because I think that's the other thing. Like when did that book come out? It was like 2012, 2013, earlier than that even.
It was earlier than that. It was earlier. I want to say like 2008, 2009 maybe.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a much like. I mean, I guess by then we were already in a at least in a superhero movie renaissance, but like a book like Sweet Tooth or like any of those Vertigo books, as we said, like Sandman had been in production hell for decades. So like the notion that we're in a space where like not just Sweet Tooth really, like if you think of like The Boys and Jupiter's Legacy, like we have all of these fucking comics that are now turning into like it's Umbrella Academy is a TV show now, like where it's a different world that we're living in than even 20 years ago.
It really, really is. I mean, like, the fact that like television has caught up, the special effects have kind of caught up so that you can kind of do these things that you could only see in a comic book page sort of justice, but then you have like the scope of television to give it sort of a long canvas,
right?
As
and
opposed
not have
to
the
trying
2 hour, right?
Yeah, like cramming 60 issues into 2 hours and like seeing like the weird thing that you get as a result of that.
Yeah.
So I can't wait. That's like I wanted to think of like something like just to show diversity and like my thought process, but like I just love that trailer so much. It's so good.
No, it's cool. It's cool. Dominic, what's Nerd Poppin'?
Speaking of special effects and superhero powers, they just recently leaked some set photos of Miss Marvel's costume.
Oh, yeah.
Did you happen to see that?
We did.
And it seems very accurate and shiny, and I'm excited about the Miss Marvel show. I don't know as many people are. And, there's some question about, like, where she gets it, because it's so comics accurate, it seems like very made, like fashioned by some alien technology or, like expensive 3D printer, not like the thrown together one. And on a purely technical note, I am curious about how her superpowers come off, her stretchy powers, as if they're like a benchmark moment, as I believe Spider-Man's web swing was in the cinematic depiction of superheroes, because like she's got stuff on that costume. She's got the bracelets, she got a sash, she's got the mask. So when she distorts her whole body, like what happens? It's not quite the same as the Mr. Fantastic thing, because he basically wears a jumpsuit, and you can distort all these things, and they don't materially affect the costume he's wearing. I'm sorry, I could go on and on. But anyway, cool looking costume.
They're not unstable molecules in the Marvel universe yet, right?
I don't think so, unless that's the first time we hear about them, and that would explain everything, because unstable molecules explain everything.
The only thing too about the comics accuracy of the costume, and this is like 3 in a row, right? We talked about WandaVision's costume, and then Sam got his comics accurate Captain American costume, and now we're seeing Iman Vellani in the Kamala Khan costume. But in the comics, Kamala is a fangirl of Captain Marvel, who was the original Ms. Marvel. And I just wonder, like, how does that weave into the MCU, since they've never really... until WandaVision, they never referred to Brie Larson's character as Captain Marvel, right? And and then... Yeah, she's never called Captain Marvel.
Spider-Man says it once in the third.
Does he?
That's absolutely the first time they don't say Captain Marvel very much.
Right.
Spider-Man said it once, so it's never explained why she has that name.
And then in the comics, Carol was Ms. Marvel first, and then Kamala is taking her original mantle. And I just wonder how that's going to weave into the... And maybe it won't, right? Like, that's just shit nerds like us care about, but... I'm super psyched. I'm excited for that show more than any of the other upcoming Marvel Disney shows. So
I'm also fascinated too, and maybe you guys got into this when you talked about like Falcon Winter Soldier, is that like that now the audience has like they've lived in this world enough that they don't blink anymore by the costumes being too comic book accurate. Like that used to be the thing, like, oh no, it's too comic booky. Mm-hmm. Like, like even like there was a time where like Falcon or Sam Wilson Captain America, like the whiteness of that costume 5 years ago. Yeah. But like it wouldn't have been so bright. And now I feel like it's cool that kind of audience are just like, yeah, that's cool. We're into it. Like,
The most fascinating thing I learned this week about Anthony Mackie's costume, Disney released, since there was no new episode this week, they released their making of special, which they did for WandaVision when that series ended. So the week in between, it was like, here's how we did the show. Apparently, the costume they created for Anthony Mackie had all these weird gaps, and like every time he turned his, because it's this fabric, every time he turns his head, it like gaps out and stuff, and it looks very unappealing. So they actually went in and CG'd his cowl in like every scene, so that when he turns his head, the fabric doesn't move.
Oh wow!
So that was wild, because I didn't even register when watching the show. Like I was just like, they were, to your point, Pornsak, they were able to like really recreate the comics costume, and then but it actually had some CG wizardry in the background to do that. So that was amazing. I was like, whoa, good on you that I didn't even notice that CGI.
That's cool. That's very cool.
I think this might go to a weird place, because I'm in this school of... I'm sorry, we can talk about this at length at some other time, but I do think the too comics accurate costume is something they're going to start to have a problem with. Like, that's why I'm fascinated by the Miss Marvel costume. That's why... And I do sort of think that the Falcon Captain American costume is too white, not racial at all, just as a color theory thing. It's like pretty white, and I wonder... I wonder if going forward, if they... Because, in this sort of golden era, they've been sort of cleverly rejiggering the costumes so they have a certain real-life feel. They get a cool halfway point.
For what it's worth, that was also Isaiah Bradley's argument that the Captain America costume was too white. Anyway, the thing Nerd Poppin' for me this week, when you're listening to this podcast, you should go over to Kickstarter. My friend Jerry Ma is launching his Kickstarter for his Monkey King comic. that is out now. There will be a link in the description below. Go to the Nerds of Color. We will have a post about his Monkey King Kickstarter. So check that out. I'm actually one of the rewards, weirdly enough. If you donate enough money, you get to actually be on a Zoom with myself, Jerry, Perry Shen, and Jeff Yang, the creators of the Secret Identities comic book that is now like 14 years old. It's weird. Like we're in such a spot that like DC, speaking of DC, is putting out its own Asian American superhero anthology, which is so wild that like that we're in a place where we can even have that. When we created Secret Identities back in 2009, like there were like 3 Asian American superheroes. So like,
yeah,
that's crazy. So yeah, check out the Monkey King on Kickstarter and support my boy Jerry. And with that, thank you for listening to Hard Knock Live. How can people find you guys on the internet, starting with Pornsak? I am
real_Pornsak on Twitter and real_Psak on Instagram, because you can't have porn in your handle on Instagram is what I found.
Racist.
Good to know. Pornists.
Dominic.
Oh, I am Dominic Ma, Dama, D-O-M-M-A-H on Twitter. And yeah, sorry, that's all.
Follow me at The Real Chow, _real_Chow, and follow the Nerds of Color at the Nerds of Color. Go to hardknockmedia.com to find this and all the podcasts in the Hard Knock family. Subscribe and download Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, everywhere you get podcasts. Like and subscribe to us on youtube.com/the Nerds of Color. Support us on Patreon and GoFundMe, and you can buy merch at TeePublic. And until next time, happy AAPI month. Pop culture with a different perspective. Watch it on your screen, hit play, so check this. This is the Hard Knock life, but not the chicken kind. More like the people in the world.